Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm Father Nathan Castle, your host. Today we're on part three of the story of Wilhelmina Mending Her Heart. It can be found in full in the second of my two Afterlife Interrupted books, Afterlife Interrupted, Helping Stuck Souls Cross Over. We often just refer to it as book two. In the previous two episodes, in the first one, I just basically described her story in brief. If you recall, she was a retired woman living a quiet, happy life with her husband, Eric. He dropped dead right in front of her while she was doing mending. She was repairing torn clothing in her front room. He dropped dead right in front of her, and she just shattered. She moved outside of herself. She said she became an actress. She couldn't bear to live in her heart, so she moved next door and lived the rest of her life, a number of years, without really inhabiting her heart. And it had a lot of consequences for her that were very unhappy. She described them in a great deal of detail in the story that you can find in the book. The second segment that we do in these stories is what we call compassionate response. I get feedback from people who have heard that story, read it, listened to it, and who have questions. And their questions, more often than not, are not simply intellectual curiosity, but they're filtered through an experience of grief that somehow the Wilhelmina story intersects with or touches. Today, we're into the third component, which we call spiritual practice. I'm a Catholic priest, and I've been a Catholic since I was 3 weeks old. I know this tradition well, and I know some of its practices that can be beneficial to people who are not Catholic or necessarily Christian. So today we're going to be looking at her story in a little more detail, particularly with regard to what we call spiritual practice. But before we even go into spiritual practice, I thought what I really wanted to do was go into her story a little bit deeper. She's a very dear person, and I love her. She died, but she's still alive because that's the way the physics of the universe works. Nobody stays dead. Everybody dies, but then lives differently afterward. So I don't think of her as dead, nor do I think of any of my loved ones who have died as dead. I simply say, for example, my mother died in 2012. My mother isn't dead. You get that distinction? It's really important to me. When we only use these stories if people give us their permission to. So we've talked with them twice. The first time was when we helped them do the crossing that these books are about. And when we think that we would like to tell their story publicly in a book or some other forum, we feel like it's important to go back to them and ask permission to do that. And we did that. And very often I've found that people not only give us that yes or no answer that we're seeking, but they give us sort of an update on what they've been doing. It just seems very natural. That's what people do. When you haven't talked with someone in a while and you resume a relationship, it's pretty normal just to say, what have you been doing since the last time we spoke? Anyway, she gave us permission. She said, I've never used this phrase before, but she picked out the phrase cautionary tale. And she said, I don't mind being a cautionary tale if it would help people avoid the pitfalls that I stepped into. She understood that by not allowing herself to feel any pain, there were a lot of consequences to that, not only for the rest of her life embodied on the earth, but even afterwards, after her death. So she said, if my story could help someone do a better job of their grieving than I did with mine, then by all means, use my story. So very egoless. She doesn't care what we think of her. I just think she's delightful, and I'm so happy for her that after a long period of avoidance of suffering and really avoidance of emotion of much of any kind, she's free and on to new experiences. Nevertheless, I'm going to start with an idea about what caution might be evoked in us by being familiar with her story, what not to do, and otherwise should you have to move into a grief that, like hers, was unexpected and deeply painful. When you go into her story, and I'm not going to recount it in full here, I've already done that, but if you're interested enough, go find it and read the details of it. But what she did not do, it seems to me, when Eric died, that day, she acted without choosing. She acted without choosing her actions. Does that seem self-contradictory to you? Didn't she choose not to feel pain? Well, I was taught that the thing that makes human beings most noble, our highest characteristic that comes from our Creator, is free will, the ability to look at options and choose among them, to choose things that are for our good or even for our ill, good for other people or not. That freedom is hugely important in a Catholic consciousness, and I think Catholic in the broadest sense of the word, universal. But there are some ways in which we can allow ourselves to drift into a way of being that we never really formally chose. Can you think of a place in your life where you've grooved some sort of habitual pattern of being, doing, thinking, and after a while you identify it as your way, but upon further inspection, you didn't actively choose it as a free agent with other options? Sometimes we can just feel like we had no choice but to. Well, that might have been true at the beginning of a process, but that doesn't mean you have to follow that process for all eternity. Is there some way in which you have drifted into some manner of being that doesn't serve you well, that upon further review you might alter? She never really did that. She drifted into, or maybe drifting isn't the right word, but maybe she sort of automatically moved outside of her heart because she just found it too difficult to live there. But it's not as though she calculated and made a really human act. She didn't really choose freely to behave as she did. She felt she had no choice, or I don't even know if she examined it at all. She was just, are you ever kind of on your way to the door to do something without even thinking about what you're doing? Anyway, if that might be true about unimportant things, but if it's something as important as your own happiness and the happiness and peace of those around you, maybe you stop and say, wait a minute, this pattern that I've developed that now seems habitual or maybe even addictive, I do have options. I could rethink. Well, she never really did that. So that would be part of what I would think is part of a cautionary tale. Wilhelmina might say to you, don't do what I did. Think before you act. Another would be, don't refuse to feel pain. Well, that's a hard one, particularly when the pain was as abrupt and as deep as her pain was. But can't you look around you and see lots of examples of degraded humanity where people have put avoidance of pain above all else? I think a lot of persons suffering with addiction end up there, that underneath their drug of choice and their repetitive desire to change their consciousness by drugging it and moving into some sort of false euphoria, underneath it very often is pain that never got dealt with. A lot of people in AA or in other kind of treatment programs are led by competent others, compassionate persons, to gently go back into their story. Doesn't mean you have to dive into the deep end of a pool of pain, but maybe you could go back into it bit by bit and allow yourself to live in your own heart again. She never really did that. She just opted or drifted into this pattern of avoiding the pain of dealing with Eric's sudden death, but she really traded it for lots of other kinds of pain. Isolation in a very low, degraded form of life, loneliness, boredom. And one of the bigger problems was, which is to me the third part of this cautionary tale, is I think Wilhelmina would say to you, please don't isolate. Eric died in front of her, and she lost her husband. But her two children suddenly lost their father. Her grandchildren suddenly lost their grandfather, and there's no reference to that at all in her story. There's nowhere in her story that she says, oh, I just felt so bad for my kids or my grandkids, or all I wanted to do was hug them and console them. There's nothing like that, because her grief just swallowed her, and she moved out of it utterly and isolated herself. You have to assume that people at church and neighbors, she kept saying that people, when she grocery shopped, would try to, get her to do something. People at church would want her to stay afterwards for the social, but she told us that she'd make excuses, that she needed to get back to the dog or the cat, that she hurried into the grocery store and bought only a few things so that she wouldn't run into anyone else. She really grooved that isolation pattern and excelled at it to her own detriment. Be careful if you're in recent grief or ongoing grief. Of course, there's space in a healthy life for solitude, but isolation, it's not a long-term recipe for happiness of any kind. You know how it says in the creation story of Adam and Eve, that God creates the first human person and says it's not good that he should be alone. Well, I took this vow where I don't have a spouse, I don't have kids of my own. It has its own built-in quality of solitude about it, but it's not the same as isolation. That's really not a good recipe for a happy life, and it certainly wasn't in her case. So check your work, and listen if somebody sounds or is giving you feedback that you might be isolating, and try to listen without being too defensive. Sometimes people who are in grief can own their grief like it's their most prized possession, and nobody has a right to say anything critical about it. We can get prickly when we're in pain, and grief causes pain, even for people who are putting their best effort into avoiding pain. Listen to people around you, and if people are saying that you're spending too much time alone and you're not allowing anyone in, maybe they're right. Maybe there could be something to be that you could moderate. So that's a little bit on the cautionary tale part. There's so much to be said about grief, and I was telling someone the other day, I didn't really write these books as grief support groups, as grief support books. Any library or bookstore has a whole section on grief support. That really wasn't what I was attempting to do. I was just trying to tell stories as they come to me and let people make of them what they will. But I do know that a lot of people are interested in what I have to offer because they are in grief, or somebody they love is. But try not to let your grief make you an island. You know that old song, "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen"? that can be a siren song. It can be really tempting to feel like the specifics of my life are so unique and unprecedented that nobody else could possibly understand what I'm going through. Well, there might be a grain of truth in that, but it might not be much more than a grain. It might be that if you did allow others to share their grief, and maybe for a minute turn down the volume of yours so that you can listen to somebody else's, that you might find that there's room on your island for someone besides you. I'm going to move on to the idea of watching your imagination. I think of the imagination as not just a bodily function connected to the brain and the consciousness that we have while we're in this lifetime. I believe that imagination is a power of the soul that goes with us when we leave our bodies. I'm a member of IANS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. I'm around a lot of people who are doing consciousness studies, what it's like to be conscious but not in the body. I think imagination goes with, I'm certain of it. So pay attention to what you imagine, and don't assume that everything you imagine is really true. That's important. In fact, when I am in groups, I'm a retreat leader, and oftentimes I'll do an exercise at the beginning of a retreat, especially if it's a sequential retreat over several days. I think imagination is so important that I start with it frequently. And I ask people to close their eyes and imagine something that's real. Take a moment, imagine any real thing with your eyes closed. Raise your hand when you've completed the task. Open your eyes and tell me what you imagined. Well, I imagined an apple, my cat, the street where I live, my daughter. Those are all things that are real that one can imagine. Then I'll say, okay, very good. Now, the next thing we're going to do is imagine something that is not real, but you can still imagine it anyway. That can be a little bit more challenging for people, but I'll say if you're finding it difficult, remember what it was like to be a child. Children can imagine all kinds of things, and children's cartoons and programs often have a lot of fanciful imaginary characters, talking animals, and so on. Comic strips do that all the time. Anyway, go inside and imagine something that you know is not real, but you can imagine it anyway, and raise your hand when you completed the task. It takes a little while longer, but people can come up with it. I often get a lot of I don't know, unicorns or dragons. I ask her who thinks they might have the most creative or outlandish, unreal thing in their imagination. And if they're younger people, they're usually better at it than old ones. That's my experience. But my standard go-to is, did anybody imagine a talking bowling ball? What? A talking bowling ball? Well, it doesn't exist. It's not real, but you can imagine it. So if your imagination can contain both real things and unreal things, it's sloppy language to call something imaginary and presume that it's unreal. You get that? The fact that something is in your imagination makes it imaginary. It's a secondary function to decide whether or not that imaginary thing is real or unreal. That's important with a lot of people who are interested in what I do, because they have spiritual experiences that others laugh off as ridiculous, or it's only your imagination. In fact, in my beloved Wizard of Oz, at a critical moment in the plot where Dorothy can't get any of the adults to pay attention to the importance of the story she has to tell about the neighbor lady wanting to kill her dog, Auntie M is just exasperated and says, so Dorothy, stop imagining things. You always get yourself worried into a fret over nothing. Here, help us out today. Have a cruller just fried. She sticks a donut in her mouth pretty much. Runs away and leaves Dorothy wondering, is there a place where there isn't any trouble? That's what Auntie M wants her to do. Get out of the way. Find yourself a place where there isn't any trouble. Well, anyway, watch your imagination, because it can be the boss of you. Your imagination can be your own like internal slave driver, especially critical voices inside that that tear down and leave you sad and depressed. Watch what's in your imagination. One thing that I just don't tolerate is the idea that there's something magic about dying that will fix everything for me. Remember that Wilhelmina was a Catholic, and she was a practicing Catholic. She did believe that she would live after she died, but somehow in her imagination, she felt like everything about it would happen around her automatically, that she didn't really need to do anything except die and all would be well. Her problems would go away without any effort on her part. She could just kind of go limp into the afterlife and everything would reset and be just as she may have hoped it would be. Well, she got into the afterlife and there were people there to greet her and help her, but they had to point out to her that that any progress that she would make would be because she made it, because she put forth the effort, that she still needed to live her life, but she had quit being the agent of it. She quit acting years before her death. And she wouldn't simply find that she would be happy in an afterlife just because that's the way everything is. She was surrounded by people who were ready to help her, and we'll go into that in a little bit, but watch your imagination that somehow that the pain that you're going through will one day just magically disappear on its own. That didn't work for her. The idea that Eric is dead. Well, I mentioned that just a little bit earlier. Eric died, but that didn't mean he stayed dead. And even though she was a Christian that went to public worship every week, she didn't have in her imagination a vivid sense of the fact that he had an afterlife, she would have an afterlife, that even while she was grieving, she might imagine some happy reunion at some point. That's not going to take away all your grief, but it's certainly a component part of how to move through it. She could have done that, but instead Eric was dead. That's all there was to it. And finally, in her imagination, there was kind of an all or nothing quality about it. Again, I don't know that she so much chose the isolation and the dissociation that ended up being her companion all the way to the grave and beyond. But she had an all or nothing character. She would not allow herself to feel one little bit of grief because she wouldn't live in her heart at all, and she moved out of it. Well, here's a question. Can you grieve and chew gum? Maybe that sounds irreverent. There's an irreverent streak that runs through me, even though my name is formally Reverend Nathan Castle. But can you do more than one thing at a time? Don't you do that all the time? Can you find a way to allow grief to take its turn in the course of a day without it being the whole day? That might take us some practice, but I think it's doable. Lots of people have done it. I know I have. I've had to go through grief, but I still went to work and I still helped other people. I found a way to moderate it or allow it to take its turn or something. That's the way I think of it. Anyway, you know how in 12-step programs, one of the mottos of AA is one day at a time. One thing that can happen is we can look at a painful emotional circumstance like grief, or maybe having to forgive some egregious wrong against you, a grudge, maybe somebody's never asked forgiveness for the assault that they made upon you or whatever. Can you, maybe with the help of a counselor, can you quantify that somehow? Can you, in your imagination, I remember once making the problem that I had with someone a mountain of shit. And I'm not calling it excrement or some other more polite way that we might refer to that. It was just shit, a pile of shit. And I thought, I have a mountain of this inside me, but I want it to leave a little at a time. I know that it won't leave all at once, but I imagined, I don't even know why I hit upon this, but you know, Pac-Man, that really or Super Mario or one of those Mario things. I never really even played these games, but I knew they existed, and they had some little thing that went down a corridor and like took one little load of stuff, like this. Or I think one of them had a little wheelbarrow that he came and he took something and took it away. For whatever reason, that was in my imagination. And this pile of shit that was in me that had the power to really do me in and ruin a whole period of my life. I would allow that in prayer times, and I'll say, I'm going to do this now. And then before I'd go to sleep, I'd pray that the Holy Spirit would make every breath that left my body full of one breath load of that toxic stuff. When you do breathe out, you're breathing out poison. You're breathing out stuff that would poison your system did it not leave efficiently through your nostrils. So before I'd go to sleep, I'd pray, may I please have a full night's worth of breaths that take away something inside me that would be toxic. So, and there's parts of grief that are toxic, especially parts of it that can go in very negative directions, like I'll never see him again, I'll never forgive myself, it's all my fault, or some other negative thing that might pertain to someone that you might be grieving. That idea that I can't stand this thought. I hear people say it sometimes as though it's an immortal truth, that when you suffer the death of a loved one, you never get over it. Go ahead and say that if you want, if you believe it's true for you, but I'm not going to receive it and take it in. I believe that things can get better if we allow them to. And yes, your loved one still has died, and they're not with you the way that they were before the day of their death. Nevertheless, I'm not going to allow myself to have to take my current state of sadness and project it all the way into the future and say it'll always be like this. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that I don't want any part of. I'm going to go into the third and final part of this segment and touch upon a few things that did seem to work in Wilhelmina's afterlife story, because she told us about the kind of treatment that she got on the other end. She mentioned that people were compassionate to her without fail, and nobody insisted that she stop grieving. But they told her that you have progress to make that we will help you make, and much of that is getting back into your heart and living in it again. She compared herself to somebody who might have had a stroke. She said, I never had a stroke, but I knew people who did. And after that assault on the body, people had to relearn powers like being able to feed themselves or speak again. Well, she said it was a little like that. I had gotten so used to not acting in my life after Eric's death that kind of atrophied. But people in the afterlife reminded her, well, you knew how to do it once, you can do it again. And they helped her go back in her story to before Eric died, and when she was the person that made all kind of free choices that she had later just quit doing. The place that she brightened the most and that her helper team noticed was girlhood stories. For whatever reason, she had a very happy childhood, and any memory of it made her brighten. Well, she hadn't been cheerful in a long time, and when her care team saw that she was cheerful when she thought of herself as a girl, they leapt on that. She remembered playing hopscotch, and she remembered the freedom and the joy and the silliness of being able to move about, hop on one foot, and so on. She remembered that she was agile, that she used to move freely, and they told her, well, you can do that again and we'll help you. And they started bringing around people to visit her. It was as though she was in something like a hospital room, or at least some little unit or apartment or cell of some kind, because that's what she wanted, to mostly be, isolated. But they kept bringing in little girlfriends from childhood, or at least bringing in people who she had been a child with and visiting with them, and they would cheer her and they would say, you know, do you remember this or that one that was in school with us? You really ought to see her now. Boy, she's, they would get her excited. And then they would often say, now, when we finish visiting you, we're going to go out to lunch. And one of these days, we're going to take you with us. So they began to plant the idea that even in the afterlife, she was capable of more than what she was allowing herself to experience. And it made sense to her. Her care team also made her know that, well, your progress is going slowly because we're working at the pace that you permit, because we respect you. We won't force you to do anything that you don't want to do, but you're only allowing us to move slowly. So that's what we're doing. They also told her, and if you begin to backslide and move away from truth, we will call you on it. If you insist on doing that, we won't be able to help you. Well, she said, that sounded like a sin to me. And remember, she was a practicing Catholic. She said, I thought it would be a sin to thwart the efforts of people who were only trying to help me, people who were very kind. So she said, I won't do that. So that was good. And then she realized the truth that she was moving slowly in kind of afterlife healing because she was only allowing them to move at a slow pace. And then she thought about herself. I thought, well, wait just a minute. I was not the brightest kid in school, but it depended upon the subject. Sometimes I could advance quite quickly if it was something that I caught on to quickly. I wasn't always the dull kid. She said sometimes I could win the ribbon or the certificate at the ceremony. So she began to push herself as somebody who was capable of being in, like she called it, the smart kid group, and forcing herself or pushing herself to expand her capacities to grow in the afterlife, until finally she was able to move on. And she didn't know that that it was going to work that way. But one of them told her too, because she was a practicing Catholic, one of them said to her, you know, these saint people, they're real, just the same way that we're real, or the kids that you went to school with are real. You don't have to just have visits from little girls that you went to school with. Somebody even suggested Mother Mary, and she said, oh my, what would that be like? And she said, and before I knew it, she was right there, undeniable, right in front of me. She didn't come with crowns or hordes of angels or somebody, you know, dressed in queenly outfits and so on. She said she was just right there in front of me, plain as could be, and said, do you know that I was a widow? So she established that rapport, that both of them had been through the loss of a husband. She said, I know what it felt like, and I was tempted to do the same thing you did. And then she went on, this is more of the storytelling that you can find in the full story of Mending Her Heart. Mary said to her, of course, your heart shattered when Eric hit the floor, so did your heart. But she said, hearts can be mended. And then, if you recall, Eric died while she was doing mending. And in her mending kit, she had a heart-shaped pincushion that had a rip in it that made some of the batting in it come out through the ripped part. Mary handed her this little pincushion thing shaped like a heart and said, here, you know what to do with this. I want you to mend it. And I think Wilhelmina said something like, she's not bossy, but she can be quite commanding. So she didn't force me to do it, but she seemed quite commanding. And so she mended her heart. And then before very long, those girlfriends that kept coming around, they said, we'd like to take you for a walk, but there's someone who would like to come along. And of course, it was Eric, her husband. And they said, he's been practicing. He was practicing how to turn himself into the 16-year-old when they were on a first date. And if you read the story, he was holding mismatched roses from his mom's garden. She made a point of saying they weren't the store-bought kind. They were different colors, and they were just ones that he had picked out of his mother's garden. But that was all it took. And she did decide, yes, it's time for me to move from here. And so she did move along with Eric. Well, that's enough for today. And for those of you that might be in deep grief, I hope that anything that I've said hasn't offended you. I wouldn't do that. I perish the thought. But I hope that if you find this story interesting, you'll go back into it more deeply and ponder it. and see if there's not a way forward for you through your grief, especially allowing it to be shared. She didn't allow that at all. Her whatever her children and her grandchildren, whatever their grief was, or any of Eric's other coworkers or neighbors, she took no part in anybody's grief but her own, and really didn't even take part in her own. Please don't do that. Well, anyway, I'm beginning to repeat myself, so it's time to sign off. What I'd like to remind you that if you'd like to be in touch with me, please do that through my website. It's nathan-castle.com. There's a contact form on there where you can send me an email through the website. Please don't ask me questions in any other forum, on Facebook Messenger or beneath a YouTube or something like that. I try to be diligent about being back in touch with people that reach out, but I would ask that you do that through the email on the website. All right, well, that's it for this version of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm grateful that you came along, and I'll see you next time. God bless you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Joyful Friar. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can make a donation by clicking the donate button. See you next time. God bless.